Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, particularly those who were at Synod and are presumably completely exhausted. I'm going to do my best to steer my way through this conversation and to give invited guests and everyone else who'd like to speak an opportunity to do so and to ask questions of one another. There are quite a lot of you, so please be mindful of time constraints. And since I'm not Geoffrey Tattersall, please forgive me for any interruptions or clumsiness in my chairing. The Synod, as you'll be aware, passed the proposals from the bishops that prayers of love and faith be used in church with same-sex couples. They stopped short of same-sex marriage, and indeed an amendment to bring forward legislation to introduce it was defeated. The one of 28 amendments that was approved was that any future prayers of blessing should not depart from the Church of England doctrine of marriage. The debate was long, 8 hours, intense, mainly respectful, with the MP Ben Bradshaw wishing that his parliament could learn a thing or two about respect and efficiency. But the responses are now coming in, and some of them are fairly devastating. In particular, the response from the Global South Fellowship of Anglican Churches, or of some Anglican churches, has issued a statement questioning the fitness of the Archbishop of Canterbury to lead the Anglican Communion and suggesting that the wider communion is now an impaired communion with the Church of England. There also seemed to be a hint within Synod that some sort of settlement needs to be agreed, some sort of pastoral measures for those who can't go along with this change in church practice, although no one is being forced to use these prayers. They're entirely discretionary and they don't require legislation. And then there are those who are also hurting because these proposals simply don't go far enough, and they're now considering what their position in the church is. So I wonder how people felt as they left Synod. And I'm just going to ask a couple of you for one sentence only on how you felt as you left Synod. And I'm going to start with Helen King, Professor Helen King.
I left feeling exhausted. I think that's pretty reasonable. And not only the 8 hour plus of debate, but 4 hours of group work the day before. And I've been part of the LLF thing since it started. So yeah, exhausted, but hopeful. I think this is a tiny change, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Busola Sodeinde, you're with the Church Commissioners, but I think you're speaking in a personal capacity. How did you feel as you left?
I felt saddened, like there was an impending divorce about to come through. But at the same time, I was extremely hopeful that there is clarity that we're different in the differentiation. So we'll come to that.
Nicola Denyer, lay minister in Newcastle Diocese?
I was really saddened in that people are hurting from every respect, actually in every perspective. Nobody wants to see that. God doesn't want us to be hurting. So yeah, I think that's where I am at the minute. But yeah, hopeful, but yeah.
Ed Shaw, Church of England Evangelical Council.
Yeah, I think there was sadness, but also I personally was encouraged that the conversation has moved on and was conducted, I think, much better than previous conversations have. And the range of relationships from different perspectives and the acknowledgement that we need to sit down and talk about future structures was an encouragement to me.
Right, we've got two bishops with us on the call. We've got Bishop Olivia Graham, the Bishop of Reading, and Bishop Jill Duff, the Bishop of Lancaster. Thank you both so much for joining us. Bishop Olivia, what seems clear is that there's a heck of a lot for you bishops to do before July, when these proposals come again for further commending, as it were. Can you lay out for us what needs to be done before July?
We brought draft prayers to the Synod, and we've got then to go through everything that we heard. We were very much in listening mode during the group work that we had for the whole of Tuesday afternoon and also the debate. And so we'll want to garner all of that together and look at the texts of the prayers. And then also there's the preparation of pastoral guidance, which will need to be issued alongside the prayers. So there is a lot of work to do before we come back to Synod in July.
Now, we know that the pastoral guidance is going to replace the document Issues in Human Sexuality. Can you lay out what it has to do, what the pastoral guidance has to guide on?
Well, it's not going to be a document that people have to sign up to. It's going to be as I understand it, a kind of guidebook one of the things that it will need to do is to cover the issue, which is very current for those wanting to go into ministry who are in same-sex civil partnerships, and clergy who would like to be who are in same-sex civil partnerships who would like to get married to their partner. The implication is of the prayers is very much that those clergy won't have to sign up to the requirement for celibacy, and also that they will be able to be married and still have a license. So the guidance will need to look at those issues really carefully. One of the things we were doing was to get feedback from the synod on what they think the guidance needs to contain and what it needs to guide us on. So there's a lot of material there, and that will need to be sifted through really carefully. And one of the points that was made towards the end of the debate actually was that we are at the moment expecting the guidance to bear a very heavy weight. And we will need to look carefully at what weight the guidance can bear and what might need to be dealt with outside of it.
Very briefly, a little bit more about that weight. What is the weight that it's being asked to bear, which it might not be able to bear?
It did seem to me that all the unanswered questions that were being raised were being sort of put on to,
yes.
Well, we'll deal with that in the pastoral guidance.
Yes.
And I think there were different categories of thing being raised, some of which can be clearly dealt with in the pastoral guidance and some which will need to be dealt with outside of it, I think.
Yes. I mean, Bishop Jill, I wonder, I mean, when the bishops produced their proposals a month or so ago, I did sort of feel like there was a big can, in a way, being kicked down the road, which was the pastoral guidance. I mean, do you think it might have been better if the bishops had produced the pastoral guidance at the same time as the proposals?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what was promised back in 2017 with a teaching document from the bishops on all these issues, which were really important issues, and that has yet to come. So, yes, I agree with you.
You bishops came in for quite a drubbing. The handling of LF was described by one commentator as a fiasco. Ian Paul said the trust in episcopal leadership is at a catastrophic low. How was that for you to hear?
Yeah, I think that was really important to hear. And actually, I think it's quite accurate. So we had 6 years listening and discerning as part of LLF. We had 6 days working out how things would go forward. So, for example, a really important part of the way forward, which Olivia's referred to, is the pastoral guidance about sex outside marriage, and what that looks like for clergy, but also laity. That's a really important decision. That wasn't something we talked about. And in my group, that was a question that came up and up again, was please could the bishops talk about sex? Can we have these really important conversations that do suggest a change of direction? The other thing that came up in the synod was how mainstream the view that I would hold was. It was 8 votes in the House of Laity that we lost the motion on, and I think people can often think it's particularly old men or unlikely people in distant countries. This is a mainstream view, and to rush at the pace we're doing and not have that theological engagement. No one talked about children, about families, quite important issues. I think that's criticism needs to be heard.
I'm interested. I mean, there were some very confessional statements and, too much information in some cases, in my opinion, as I was watching Synod. But I do have to ask you this question. So in talking about these prayers and in the bishop's conversations so far, there hasn't been any discussion about sex?
No.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up. Can I ask? The bishops were largely behind the motion, and a small number of bishops approving several of the amendments that came forward, but which were voted down. Is there trust within the bishops as this process goes forward?
Yeah, I think we want as bishops to keep the church together. That's part of our calling, isn't it? It's also a calling to be teachers of the church and guardians of the faith. And I think there's been key elements that I think have eroded that in the last 2 weeks. by things that were talked about in documents, people going beyond that in terms of whether that's direction of travel, whether that's talking about sex outside marriage. These were, as a House of Bishops, the College, we hadn't discussed or agreed things, and then things went beyond. That needs trust building. I have raised this privately, and I think that won't be something that you'd be surprised about, just because that's what's shown in the data that we're seeing.
I want to disagree with my sister Bishop Jill on that. I think that the process that we've been through as bishops has brought us together like nothing else. And I think that we have been incredibly honest with each other about very personal stuff, about our differences, about our theology, about our starting points, about what's shaped and formed us. I think we've had some really honest, deep conversations with each other. Where I do agree with her is that I think we are absolutely committed to walking together and to keeping the church together. And that's a key part of our calling. But I don't agree that there's been a breakdown of trust between us. I think we have grown to trust each other through our disagreements and our differences.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to try and make sure that we cover a lot of areas. We have got a voice missing today. Somebody from the Society of St Wilfrid and Hild was going to join us and then was unable to. They've issued a statement. This kind of seemed to have a watching brief on this, which welcomes the commitment to maintaining the doctrine of marriage, which is shared with the great churches of East and West, Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Now, we had Archbishop Angelos of the Coptic Orthodox Church, who's the ecumenical representative on the Synod, saying that what's said in General Synod reverberates around the world, but there's a difference which Synod may understand between blessing and holy matrimony, which is not readily understood elsewhere. And I'm wondering whether that might also be true of areas of the Anglican communion as well, which is the next area I'd like to come to. Now, Busola Sodeinde, you gave a very strong speech in Synod, talking about how you felt that this would impact on the Anglican communion. We've now had a statement from the Global Fellowship of Southern Anglicans, some of their churches, absolutely not all. It's really important to stress that. But basically saying we don't know if we can have the Archbishop of Canterbury as our leader, whether he's fit to be our leader anymore. And we think we might now be in impaired communion with the Church of England. I mean, that's got to be, well, apart from anything else, it's got to be devastating for the Archbishop of Canterbury to hear that, hasn't it, after the speech that he gave in Synod about his love for the communion?
You could tell from my very passionate plea that I could tell that the storm was coming. So I knew I had some sort of intelligence that this was coming. And I think what was really worrying to me was just the lack of due diligence that this exercise had carried, that we hadn't really formally consulted all of them to get the range of responses of its impact. And I know that while some of the bishops weren't present in Lambeth conference, it was because of these issues. And I thought actually really consulting with them and Synod having a view of the ranges would have been important for us to bear that into consideration. And I think the analogy I really wanted to really bake in here, and I think everyone could identify, is Brexit, basically. Because you get into Brexit where all the facts are there, some were furnished and some weren't. And the point is when you're impaired, you can't go back. And I wanted to make sure that actually, can we pause for a minute and get all our documents done first and then go back?
Right. Thank you for the correction. Global South Fellowship of Anglicans. I had my name a little bit wrong. I apologise. But what did we learn at Synod about the impact of the Anglican communion that we didn't know before? I mean, you wanted much more consultation from the primates, but we already knew, didn't we, that this wasn't going to go down well. Did we get some new information?
The information that came out was from Reverend Foley, who came after me. And it was almost to talk about the fact that was this a price to pay for Christians who are killed across the world. In Nigeria, there's a Christian killed every 2 hours. Churches are burnt, and those in the north are risking their lives every day. And I think there's some homework that we could have done behind the scenes to ensure that when this announcement or how we get there, that was carefully threaded on. And I think we didn't do that. And I think Synod wasn't fully appreciating the fact that actually it wasn't just, and I'm really open, just to make that really clear on this podcast, I'm really open that actually all voices needed to be heard. And that was the point of equity, that their voices weren't being heard. And the voice is that actually this would trigger a lot of persecution for some countries who believe that the Western values are being imposed on them.
Professor Helen King, could you respond to that? Because I'm just sort of aware that a lot of gay Christians, LGBT Christians, will be thinking that's an awful thing to put on us. People who've been waiting for something, not full equality, but something, and how they might respond to that. Helen,
I'm quite surprised of the reactions today from the Global South, because the fact that we passed that amendment saying that the final version should not be contrary or indicative of a departure from the doctrine of the Church of England on marriage, I would have thought would reassure them. And what I got from what the Archbishop of Canterbury was saying was very much that there had been conversations behind the scenes, that his role as in the Anglican Communion is about talking to people as individuals, about relationships, not about big statements and huge meetings, but about relationships with leaders. And I was encouraged by what he said. And also that he is trying to hold together these very different roles to the Church of England and to the wider Anglican Communion. And that's a big juggling act. And, all credit to him at the moment. I think he's doing really well on it. And I think, he needs our prayers because he's juggling the impossible.
I wanted to make a point of that. And I think my point was that Synod needed to see or have that transparency. Because there's one thing for him to say it, but we don't know. And so when you're making a decision and you have a legislative body making a decision such as this, you needed that transparency. And I think one of the things I was saying in my report, or the report that was referred to on LLF, the confirmation or the conclusion there was that actually, to the LLF body, was that there was more work that was required. And I think that was also ignored.
Just a really small point there, that the transparency thing. So when Synod was talking in a previous meeting about what was happening to LGBTQ people in Ghana, the Archbishop was very clear that things were happening that he could not be transparent about, because that itself would be dangerous. So I think, although I'm a great fan of transparency and everything else, I think here, where it's so sensitive, I need to trust the Archbishop's private connections with the other provinces.
Is there anyone else who wants to make a point on this particular area of the Anglican Communion and indeed relations with other churches? I note that there's somebody from the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales here, but I won't put them on the spot unless they want to contribute. It would be interesting to hear if there was any response from the Church of Rome. Bishop Olivia.
Just a small point. We had the privilege of hearing from Archbishop Sami during the Synod debate, who spoke movingly about the effect that it would have on his province if we passed this motion. But I was aware that we had two other visitors from the Anglican Communion. We had Archbishop Julio from Panama and Bishop Martinez from Brazil. If either of them had been asked to speak, we would have heard a very different story. And so the picture across the Anglican Communion is not uniform at all. And indeed, there are a good number of provinces which do same-sex blessings or marriage. So I think we just need to be aware that the Anglican Communion is not a homogeneous body. It's varied.
I absolutely agree with all the points that have been made, that it's a sensitive issue, that it's going to be different in lots of places around the Anglican Communion. But what we have to also remember is the way that LGBTQIA plus people have been treated, Christians. And, I deal in stories. Stories make sense. And there are occasions where people have left and fled countries because of their sexuality or identity, come to church here and then been thrown out of the churches here as well, which has led to suicide. So again, this is one story from the other side. It is about diversity and it's about how we deal in difference all the way through this, I think.
Ian Paul, you wanted to make a point about this Archbishop Council member and priest?
Yes, I think this whole thing has been immensely damaging. I think the I said that the confidence in the episcopal leadership of the House of Bishops is catastrophically low, and I think it's got even lower after this synod. And I think, in particular, Justin's reputation, I think, has been immensely damaged. On the one hand, he got quite tearful about saying that, as a result, if we vote this forward, then Christians in Africa will suffer. And then he rejected Busola's amendment and voted for it. So he's on the one hand saying people are going to suffer, and then he's saying, but I'm voting for that. I couldn't make sense of that. I felt it was embarrassing to have in the chamber, we had Archbishop Sammy pleading with us not to pass this, and Justin sat and heard him and voted for it. And we had Archbishop Angelus as well, also saying this is going to seriously damage ecumenical relationships. And if Justin is right in saying I have consulted, then all that Busola's amendment was doing was asking for formalization of that which he said was already happening. And this happened time and time and time again, which is that lots of the amendments were simply asking the bishops to do what they had said informally they were already going to do. So why did they resist these amendments? And one of the key moments in the chamber was when Stephen Hoffmeyer made a procedural point and said, why are the bishops vetoing everything? There were 5 amendments which the House of Laity voted for and the House of Bishops vetoed. And when he started to say that, there was a very loud and very long applause from all the clergy and the laity. I think the bishops are going to have to do some really significant bridge building because confidence in their leadership has hit absolute rock bottom.
Right, well, there you go. We've heard that, and I'm sure the bishops here have heard that. But I think I guess Bishop Olivia's point that there were 2 other Anglican bishops there who weren't called to speak, it makes you wonder about the planning, really. But there you go. So if we can move on from that for now, we might come back to it later. I mean, the other thing that was quite interesting towards the end, I've got a little note here from Bishop Olivia. It wasn't the bishops who kept asking for the vote to be counted by houses. That was that Julian guy, wasn't it? Every time. In fact, I even wondered if the Archbishop of York put the Bishop of London a bit on the spot to say we need to bring something forward. We need to bring something forward that is going to some pastoral guidance and pastoral protection. I think the word might have been used for people who can't go along with this. I just wonder, Ed Shaw, what you think that sort of provision might be. I mean, these proposals are discretionary, but you're seeming to suggest, if I'm right, that that there might need to be, I don't know, different silos in the church for different groups who think differently on this issue.
In some ways, the jury's still out on what we passed because we don't have the pastoral guidance. We don't really actually know what we agreed to yesterday, particularly around the role that the Church of England thinks sex plays in a relationship, and the guidance is unwritten. And so in some ways, until July, it's really hard to know how to respond to any of this because we're not actually sure what we said yes to, which is a slightly opposition.
Is anyone sure? Can I just ask, is anybody sure what was said yes to? Because if we had that clear, that might help this discussion. Right, okay, on you go, Ed.
If what we've passed is that sex and marriage are no longer come together in the Church of England's doctrine and liturgy, we have a massive problem because for centuries, all throughout the world, there has been a link between marriage and sex. It's been expressed in different times in different ways, and Miranda gave us a history lesson at one point, and we need to recognise how that has been recognised at different times in different ways. But the historic tradition of the Church of England has been that sex is for marriage between a man and a woman, and that has been changed. If that has been changed significantly, the structures of the Church of England will need to change significantly because there will be part of the Church of England that holds on to and celebrates that apostolic inheritance, and there'll be part of the Church of England that doesn't, and we'll need to recognise those 2 different places in our structures if we're going to continue to somehow stay together.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't see that somebody was sure about what's in our pastor. Miranda put her hand up. We'll come back to looking at what those structures and provisions might mean, Ed. Miranda.
I thought it was quite clear what we passed yesterday, which was to welcome that the bishops had brought forward these draft prayers for trial and for use over the next few years and for review to see how that goes. And that there was a really important apology in there and a commitment from the bishops, which Bishop Sarah from the platform reiterated many, many times, that the bishops were accepting and repenting of the way that LGBTQIA plus people have been very often treated in the church, have been excluded, have not been listened to. And they accepted that in making that apology, that required that we changed the way that we related to them. And that required acknowledgement of their relationships and of all that was good in their relationships, and hence these prayers of blessing. I thought that was quite clear.
Right, now you gave a very instructive history lesson about countering the idea that the church has always had one doctrine of marriage, as it were, or one understanding of marriage. But I mean, I wonder what happens in a way once, it's as Ed says really, once you decouple the idea of sex as belonging within a married relationship, and the church is not going to change its doctrine on marriage. Once you do that, you do just open up a whole minefield for doctrine, don't you?
I mean, this particular point I think was about structures, and yes. I find that rather an over-the-top response. I mean, it seems to me that the obvious parallel here is with the debates that we had several decades ago about remarriage after divorce, which was in many ways a much more direct challenge to the doctrine of marriage, certainly in terms of specific references that Jesus made in the Gospels. The idea that we can bless marriages after divorce. And the structure that was put in place then was simply that priests can choose to use those prayers, or they can choose in conscience not to. And that served the Church of England very well, and has been largely uncontentious since, although the debates at the time were just as contentious as this one has been. So my hope and prayer is that, in fact, once the heat of the moment and the understandable heat of the particular debate has died down, we'll find that we can very happily live together with that freedom of conscience for different clergy.
But you would resist anything which should have set up some sort of formal arrangements, like we have with flying bishops and so on, for people who are dissenting from these proposals.
Yes, I would. I mean, it was very, very clear in the debates we had about wearing bishops that this question was explicitly raised back then. Are we saying that if we set up arrangements like this, everyone knew that the debates on same-sex relationships were going to be the next big contentious thing coming? And the question was raised: are we going to use this as a precedent and a model for what happens then? And it was said absolutely not. I think it would be incredibly unhelpful to do so, and unnecessary.
So Ed, when we're talking about these possible new structures, you said you'd be very happy to. I think you said you'd be very happy to be in a big church where same-sex couples get married, but it would have to be a different bit of the church to the church you were part of. I mean, that suggests all sorts of structural provisions, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I guess it's one of the sort of issues we've got at the moment is trying to work out, first of all, what we decided yesterday, and also where we are on a journey to same-sex marriage. There are some people that think we're never going to get there because the Church of England is fundamentally orthodox and will remain an orthodoxy or grow in the Church of England. And certainly there's stats to sort of suggest that. There are others that think, actually, we're on an inevitable journey to same-sex marriage. And rather than, as it were, continue the pain for years, decades, why not sit down and come up with some form of settlement, some sort of new structures that allow us to live together while recognising and protecting fundamental convictions, that we just need to get on and do that now so we can concentrate on other things. And I guess, I'm moving towards being in that position. I don't agree with equal marriage, but if we are going to get there, why not, as it were, speed up the conversation and actually sit down and recognise that there are differences that we can't solve, that there's a massive problem with unity that the votes at General Synod represent. Can we sit down and think of imaginative new structures, very different to the sort of settlement after the introduction of women bishops, a settlement that recognises actually this is a very different issue to remarriage after divorce and divorce. Can we actually sit down and come up with really exciting, bold new structures that allow the Church of England's mission to continue and the focus to go from sex and marriage and on to telling people about Jesus within exciting new structures?
And do those structures, I wonder, how do they deal with the money? Because, I mean, what we're hearing is that big evangelical churches are going to withhold money from the common fund because they don't like what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's debate about where is the money in the Church of England? Is the money in big evangelical churches, or is it actually sitting, in the Church Commissioner's bank account? There's a huge amount of, oddly, there's a huge amount of money in the Church of England, just to say that it rests with big evangelical churches, is not actually true. I would love us not to be sort of having to withhold money. I'd love us to be sitting down and talking in a room about new structures that mean that nobody's having.
Why would you be withholding money? Why withhold money at this point?
Well, personally, I'm not withholding any money at this point. But I think what people who are withholding money are doing, if I've understood them correctly, not one of them, so you probably have to ask them yourself, is they're wanting to protest against what's happening. And it's very hard for a local parish church to find effective ways of protesting against their bishop and their bishop's understanding of same-sex relationships and marriage. And one of the most effective ways they have is money. That's not the only way. It might not be the way that everybody chooses. But if you're wanting to protest, it is a way of, say, you protest, and also creating the differentiation, the structural changes, beginning to sort of make those happen on the ground as an encouragement for them to happen in a much more grown-up and godly way.
Got a couple of hands up. I'm going to go to Ian Paul now, and after that to Bishop Olivia.
So I want to go back to the previous point about clarity, which is that there is no clarity. The apology, it's not clear what we're apologising for. That's why Jane Ozanne had an amendment to remove it, and I agree with her. There's no clarity there at all. There's no clarity about the prayers, because there was lots of discussion about those. We had 4 hours of group work, and the bishop's going to take that into account. Andrew Atherston, in a question, pointed out that the bishop said contradictory things about the status of the prayers. They're claimed not to be liturgy, but they clearly are liturgy. They're claimed not to be part of a services, but even Stephen Cottrell talked about the use in services. There's no clarity. They rest on a distinction between matrimony and holy matrimony and marriage. That distinction does not exist, and it cannot exist. It never has done before. It's resting on claimed legal advice, which is actually majorly faulty. I mean, I don't think there's anything that's clear at all about the future yet.
Oh, Ian, did you also have a point to make about the money side of things as well?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I think the difficulty with issues around money is that the common share is entirely voluntary. I think that it relates actually to the ecumenical matter, and the issue on the ecumenical matter is that, perhaps we as Helen King said, that we ought to point other churches to the statement that the marriage isn't changing. Unfortunately, the Church of Uganda has put their finger on it. The Church of Uganda has made a statement this morning saying the Church of England is very good at saying two completely contradictory things and expecting that people will choose the one they like and stay with it. And they perceive, and this is the point that Archbishop Angelus made very, very clearly. He said, it's all very well making these fine distinctions between blessing people but not blessing a relationship. He said, I'm sorry, the rest of the world does not understand that. And it's the clarity itself which is leading to the problems. The bishops have managed to offend everybody on every side by effectively having two contradictory statements at the same time.
Yeah, but Anglican fudge has always been really good in some respects, hasn't it? Let's go to.
But you can't do it when there's a matter of doctrine. You cannot have institutional unity when you've got theological incoherence. The one will not deliver the other.
Thank you. Let's go to Bishop Olivia.
Thanks, Rosie. I don't want to go back over the debate which we had, because we sat through 8 hours of it already over the last couple of days. But I did just want to come back to this point that Ed was talking about. He's talked about the difficulty being that one part of the church now believes this, and one part of the church now believes that, and therefore that we ought to have some sort of an agreement about differentiation. I wanted to say two things about that, really. One is that one of the difficulties is that you can't talk about this part of the church and that part of the church, because as every parish priest in the land knows, within their congregations, they have people of many different views on all issues, and particularly on this one. And I get a lot of correspondence with parish clergy in my area who are saying, we have, very mixed congregation. This includes some of the big evangelical churches. People are not of a mind. So in order to provide what Ed is talking about, I think, we would have to ask people to separate out into blocks of belief on this issue. And it's not something which I think it's possible to do. That would destroy our polity, it would destroy who we are as a community. And the church is a community of love, and acknowledging difference. The other thing, quickly, if I may, is just to point out that the Church of England was forged in the crucible of disagreement. 450 years we've had this, and we have disagreed over slavery and polygamy and contraception and marriage to deceased wife's sister and divorce and remarriage, and there's a long list of things that we have disagreed about profoundly, which in their day were huge issues that really upset people badly, but we've managed to stay together through all of that. And I would be deeply distressed if the church were to somehow divide in some way over this. I think if we could revisit the arrangements we made for women to be bishops, we might, with hindsight, not have done the thing that we did. But I think it's profoundly un-Anglican to keep on talking about dividing over issues of understanding or belief.
The Pentecostal church came out because the doors were shut on them in the 60s when the blacks came into this country. And the Pentecostal church is still thriving, and the theology is very similar to the Evangelical church. But they were very prepared to shut their doors, and they haven't talked to them about bringing them in. So when you talk about differentiation and theology, I really challenge that you have shut your doors to those who have the same theology as you, but we're different. And so we accommodated a different space for them. I'm not talking about how it should happen, but it can happen, where you give different spaces for people to express what it is, the spiritual unity they see within their congregation. And I really wanted to address that in terms of racial disunity. Why don't you bring them in then? Because the theology is the same to a certain degree. But when I talk about the money issue, it's linked in a way. Because I wouldn't want to really label the point that it's evangelical or any denomination. That's not the point I want to make here. But when people tithe, because we tithe, because that's what we believe in, we tithe. Giving in the Church of England has reduced drastically. I've seen the buckets go through where people put £1 in, but there are people who tithe because they believe in the mission. And so what I'm saying is, I'm not talking about institutional money. I'm talking about the money that lies in the hands of your congregation. They want to give to a ministry that they want to see flourish in terms of its understanding of its doctrine. And so where they might withhold money, not from the institutional perspective, but from a personal perspective, they want to put their money where they see that mission growing.
One point of clarification, the reason why Jane Ozanne put in an amendment asking for the apology to be removed was not because it was unclear what they were apologising for, so much as that to offer an apology while continuing to do the same thing is not a true apology. And I think that's important. While I'm here on the structural differentiation question, I don't like the idea of structural differentiation. I'm willing to consider it if that's really what people feel is necessary. But what I need to know is, in what does unity consist? If some people have separate bishops, if some people have separate ordinations, separate consecrations, separate theological training institutions, in what way would we be one church? And that's what I would like to hear from the people who support structural differentiation. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And I think that is what we're going to be able to sit down and talk about if we take up the invitation I think the Archbishop of York was giving us to talk about. And I think Helen is right that we both need to talk about what does divide us, but what can and will unite us going forward. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with the Archbishop of York and whoever else he's wanted to draw into that conversation going forward, because clearly, I want the maximum degree of unity around, everything that means I'm an Anglican in the first place, alongside structural differences or structural differentiation because of the things we now clearly disagree with. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with the Archbishop of York and whoever else he's going to invite to have that conversation going forward.
Is there anybody who hasn't spoken yet who might like to contribute something. I don't want to put him on the spot too much, but Kenson from Mirfield, you're an ordinand in the Church of England. You're going to be ordained next year, and you spoke at synod. I just wonder how you feel in the aftermath of this synod and in the run up to July.
I think from the colleges that I've been in, among ordinands, it's also reflects the bigger picture, that it's not so straightforward. We have differences of views, and the thing about the structure is the RMF. I suppose Ian Paul has pointed out before, they want a common syllabus, but that is not the way forward. And holding the plurality of views together, I suppose it's part of training, part of our ordination training, to hold different views together. And I think we do it very well here at Mirfield in our tutor groups. We hold different views, but we share them. And I think that is what we've seen in the group work so far, that we can work very well. So yes, from the ordinand's point of view, it certainly is not just for or against, or liberal or conservative. And I speak as an ethnic minority, that it's definitely not, if we include the global majority people, then it must be a conservative view on this thing, because as I've spoken, I'm part of the inclusive church. And I've seen a lot of cases where people come to our church for refuge, coming from different parts of the Anglican communion, and that is something to hold on to, that we have already begun that ministry. We must not let that go or write it off, and we must choose our words very carefully. Whatever way forward we decide to go, we must choose our words very carefully, so that people can still come to us for refuge and safety. I suppose this is what we are being trained as well, as part of ordination training.
Thank you. I'm just, again, wondering about the outside perception of this. Whether it matters what the world outside thinks about this, but how do you think people who've just caught this on the news, how they perceive it, how, the question about, how being salt and light in the world or not?
Well, it's one of the very difficult things nowadays with social media and with international media, that obviously whenever you try and present something like this, and thank you for doing these really in-depth briefings, because it's so hard to try and communicate some of the complexities of these to such very different audiences. So how the outside world will see this, I mean, obviously is as varied as different definitions of the outside world. There'll be some people who think, why on earth is the Church of England still talking about this? Didn't we all agree this was okay 30 years ago? That's quite a large view that I'm hearing. And of course, there'll be people who are saying, how on earth dare the Church of England even think about this? I do want to just clarify on the point about the Anglican Communion. I mean, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about the relationships between the churches of the Anglican Communion and the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury, given the kind of historic nature of these churches as having, a historic relationship with the Church of England because of previous evangelism. But right from the very beginning, right from the very first Lambeth Conference back in the middle of the 19th century, it was absolutely clear and stated explicitly that every individual national church in the Anglican Communion is independent and self-governing. And when the first Lambeth Conference was called, it was made absolutely clear and given as an assurance to a lot of bishops who were very concerned about going to it, that individual churches were never going to seek to interfere in decisions and policy making of the different churches. So we need to be really clear that, obviously churches all around the world are very welcome to say that they disagree with what the Church of England is deciding, just as we're free to make comments, positive and negative, about decisions that other churches make. But the different churches of the Anglican Communion are independent and self-governing and would never seek at an institutional level to influence each other's decision-making. And we know that within the Anglican Communion now and over the past few decades, we've had churches which ordain women and don't ordain women, and there were lots of similar debates to this back at the beginning, and it was agreed that we could walk together just with that. And similarly about this issue, the Lambeth been debating this for 30 or 40 years. This is not new.
But I think what I wanted to really talk about or get here is about how this all appears to people outside the churches, full stop. Bishop Jill.
Isn't it interesting, because it can sound like all you want to do is talk about sex, and that's the thing, is that sex.
You don't in the House of Bishops, do you? That's the problem.
Well, we don't, do we? But otherwise, it kind of boils down to that, doesn't it? And the thing is, sex is about relationships. Relationships are the fabric of life, and our attitudes to this area affects children, it affects family life, it affects that sense of inclusion or exclusion as well. So I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I think people might think what they're talking about is quite weird, it's quite niche. And my experience of some of our churches that are growing and kind of reaching younger generations is that when there's a church recently in the north, and he did a series on sex and sexuality in the mornings, and some young women came along and thought, this is weird what you're talking about, but if this is what Jesus is after, I'm in. And so it's it crosses that boundary of that sort of there's a kind of mystique about church. A lot of what we believe is weird. Why are we worried that Jesus came back from the dead? Why are we worried about miracles happening or not? But actually, as you get a taste of things, you discover a whole nother world. And my experience of chatting to my friends who aren't anywhere connected to the Church of England is it's weird, but it's intriguing. And I think that was an interesting example with a kind of journalist I spoke to at the Church House. He said, the thing about the Church of England is, you have your discussions in public, often the things that are very hard for other faiths to talk about. And I think that's kind of a plus and a minus, isn't it, really? But it's people, you say the word sex and people lean in, and that's an interesting point to make.
Thank you. Charlie Bell's just joined us. So Charlie, I don't know if you want to come in on the end of that conversation we've just been having, or I know that we were going to talk a little bit about theology and the extent to which there has or has not been theology in this process, which I know is something Ian's also really hot on.
Yeah, hi. So I'm so sorry. I was saying the mass at lunchtime, so I'm just joining you a bit late after doing my second day job. Just to pick up on this idea of all the church wants to talk about sex, I might just qualify that a little bit. What it appears to from the outside world is that all the church wants to talk about is other people's sex. I.e., all the church seems to want to do is to control how gay people do or do not have sex. So a couple of things on that. One, not all relationships in general, married or otherwise, are sexual, and certainly not all relationships, certainly within marriage and the marriage that same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples want to engage in. Sex is not the key thing here. Sex is not what sex is not what homosexual love is about primarily. And we've obsessed about sex of other people. There are a couple of comments in Synod yesterday which were, I'm afraid, to someone who is gay and in a relationship, were egregiously offensive. The suggestion that sex between, or the idea that gay people might have sex would destroy the marriages of heterosexuals, or would mean that all of the call to celibacy that individuals feel will be destroyed by the idea that some gay people might have sex. That is an absurd argument. Absurd, and I'm being gentle. So I found that to be just a very bizarre intervention. On the theology part, it fits very much with this. The idea at the moment is essentially, well, we can't give gay people marriage, and sex is for marriage only. So therefore, and that seems to therefore be the outcome. So we never have a serious conversation. And then we complain, or certain people in Synod are complaining, that we're now saying, well, anything goes and we no longer have a theology of sex. Well, if you won't let us debate marriage, this is where it ends up. The idea of debating marriage is the idea of debating a fairly conservative institution, i.e. an institution in which we say sex, or in which we say is the right place for sex. We have been unable to have that conversation. You cannot be surprised that therefore we have to talk about sex outside of marriage, or at least, as the bishops have done, left a silence. I actually commend the bishops for leaving a silence on this. They don't agree. None of us really seem to agree on this. We haven't agreed for years, and all we've done is have silence, and a silence of oppression run by a powerful elite. Often that powerful elite has taken the form of bishops. In the most recent times, that powerful elite has taken the form of particular theological perspectives. Enough of this. I think it's wonderful that we've got to a position where we're actually being honest. We disagree, we're unable to agree on sex, and a very small, loud, and frankly often rather unpleasant minority have said, and you may not talk about marriage. It's nonsense. And we just need to move beyond this idea that somehow there's no theology. We're not being allowed to do it.
Thank you. I've got 3 minutes left and I've got 3 people. I'm going to go to Nicola for 1 minute, Busola for another, and Ian for another. Please put in the chat box. We'll leave the chat box open for a couple of minutes after we've finished. I do want to finish really promptly. So the time is on.
Most of the people I know are a mixed bunch in the northeast of England who really fundamentally don't care what the church does, actually, because in here not that many people go to church, certainly of my age group anyway. What people care about is how we treat each other. And my kind of overarching of synod and where we are now is that most people think the church are just a bunch of people who argue with each other. So realistically, like Ed said, I'm up for working out how we move forward on this and agree to disagree, but that the power is equalised right across the board.
Yeah, so I think just to wrap it up for me, it's thinking about the diaspora. We talked about the external Anglican, but the diaspora living in the UK, which is now very diverse. And we have to bring in what is their culture. We have a lot of immigrants coming with their views or their traditional views, perhaps maybe at odds with where we are. And so one of the things I made in my statement was actually we need to embrace, from a place of inclusivity, our cultures as well that we bring in. And so we need to create a space, actually, that we can bring up our children with the culture that we've inherited to still flourish in the UK. So for me, this went beyond just sex in itself, but that plead into the UK that please, you have to give us our space as well to live out our culture here.
Miranda's mistaken about the communion. It's always been interdependent, not independent, number one. Number two, I'm really pleased to hear from Charlie that I'm not part of the elite because I don't want silence, and I've been writing about the theology of sex for a long time, and we do need to do it. But the idea that the Church of England is a place where we just simply have variation of what people believe is just nonsense. In the ordination vows, I've stood up and I said, I believe in the doctrine of the Church. I will teach it. I will model it to others. The idea that that's optional is just crazy. It makes no sense. And lastly, on mission, when people hear a church where we just don't believe anything, and we don't have the integrity to believe the things we've said we're going to believe in public, that damages mission. And that's why the churches which are clear and confident in the doctrine of the church are the ones that, by and large, are the ones that are growing.
Right. Now I've got 30 seconds. I'm giving it to Kenson because it's his first RMC Zoom and he deserves to be heard.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to disagree with Busola. I do not think you can just tie diversity with traditional views. Absolutely not. That's a false equation. And that's all I want to say for my contribution. Thank you.
Right. I would like to just note Bishop Olivia's comment at the end. Lots of people, young LGBT plus people, not in our church because of the inability to affirm their relationships and the damage done to them. And just looking at any other chats in there as well. So we'll leave it on for 2 minutes in case you want to respond to anything each other has said. But I am going to take my leave now and suggest we all turn off from this for the weekend if we possibly can. Thank you so much for joining me, everybody.